morning, everyone. Welcome.
大家早上好，欢迎大家参加2024年世界流感大会。在昨天的一天的讨论之后，我们今天非常期待着早上的会议。接下来有请潘烈文。我们第一个发言人是孔凡毅，他是香港大学医学院的传染病专家。他是在医疗科学方面的一位专家。他是香港大学公共卫生学院讲席。潘烈文是香港大学公共卫生学院讲席教授。我们的第一位发言人是香港大学李嘉诚医学院传染病系主任孔凡毅。孔凡毅是我们的第一位发言人。大家早上好，欢迎大家来到海南，也欢迎大家来参加2024年世界流感大会。我是来自香港大学的孔凡毅。我很抱歉，我不能亲自去现场出席此次会议，因为我目前正在休假。我要感谢 John Tan 教授邀请我给大家做一个分享，来讲一讲与 mRNA 疫苗相关的不良事件和结果，利与弊。接下来我跟大家共享一下幻灯片。我想大家一定能够看到幻灯片吧？这是我的免责声明，给大家总的介绍一下 mRNA 疫苗发展的情况。mRNA 实际上是在1961年发现的，在1963年发现了干扰素可能被 mRNA 诱导，还发现了 mRNA 的5末端修饰。然后在实现由 sp6RNA 聚合酶催化的体外 mRNA 转录之前，又花了20年。随后发现细胞免疫可由 mRNA 诱导，接着发现体液免疫也可由 mRNA 诱导。在2005年，作为核苷修饰 RNA 无免疫原性的证明。直接注射 mRNA 作为人类癌症治疗的第一次应用始于2009年，并且进行了第一次临床前试验，进行了 DC 靶向 mRNA 的淋巴结内递送。随后，在2017年开始了第一次概念性、个性化 mRNA 癌症疫苗的人体试验，出现了针对各种呼吸道病毒，包括 RSV、呼吸道合胞病毒和癌症的 RNA 疫苗的研究趋势。当然，后来在2020年爆发了新冠肺炎疫情，并进行了针对新冠肺炎疫情疫苗的 mRNA1723的1期临床试验。当然，随后还有不同类型的针对流感和其他限制性病毒的 mRNA 疫苗正在研发当中。我会后边对此进行进一步的介绍。这里展示的是 mRNA 疫苗的图片。基本上来说，是通过无细胞生产流程制备成脂质纳米颗粒疫苗。 首先，体外转录的 mRNA 包含5个结构元素，一个包含7甲基鸟苷通过3磷酸桥连接到2O 甲基化核苷酸的5撇帽子，2侧的5和3非翻译区，一个开放阅读框和一个 poly 尾巴。下面的图证明了 mRNA 是合成生产并制成疫苗的。一旦病原体的基因组被测序，目标抗原的序列就被设计并插入到质粒 DNA 构造中。质粒 DNA 在体外被噬菌体聚合酶转录成 mRNA。mRNA 转录物通过高效液相色谱被纯化，以去除污染物和反应物。纯化的 mRNA 与脂质在非流控混合器中混合形成脂质纳米颗粒。快速混合使脂质瞬间包裹 mRNA， 并沉淀为自组装的纳米颗粒。这对于保护 mRNA 至关重要，防止它进入整个细胞后分解。纳米颗粒溶液经过透析或过滤，以去除非水溶性溶剂的任何未包裹的 mRNA。过滤后的 mRNA 疫苗溶液被储存在无菌瓶当中，这就是 mRNA 疫苗的制备过程。就免疫反应而言，注射的 mRNA 疫苗被抗原成地细胞内吞。mRNA 进入胞质后，由核糖体翻译成蛋白质。翻译的抗原蛋白可以通过几种方式刺激免疫系统。细胞内抗原被蛋白酶体复合物分解成较小的片段，片段通过主要组织相容性复合体 I 类分子在细胞表面展示给细胞毒性 T 细胞。活化的细胞毒性 T 细胞通过分泌溶细胞分子，如穿孔素、颗粒酶等，杀死感染细胞。此外，分泌的抗原可被细胞摄取，在内体内部降解，并通过 MHC 2类蛋白在细胞表面呈递给辅助性 T 细胞，就是 CD4 加 T 细胞。辅助性 T 细胞通过刺激 B 细胞产生抗体，并通过炎性细胞因子激活吞噬细胞，如巨噬细胞，有利于循环病原体的清除。现在我们来看看正在研发的 mRNA 疫苗。有不同的 mRNA 疫苗正在研发过程当中，其中许多是呼吸道和潜伏性疫苗。预防性疫苗着眼于预防，当然包括新冠肺炎疫苗、流感疫苗以及新冠和流感联合疫苗或 RSA 疫苗 HMPV 加上 RSA 疫苗。潜伏疫苗，当然我们正在寻找针对变异疱疹的预防保护，包括巨细胞病毒疫苗、EBV 疫苗、HSV 疫苗、VZV 疫苗，当然还有非疱疹 HIV 疫苗，还有肠道疫苗，如诺如病毒疫苗，还有细菌疫苗，如莱姆病疫苗，同时还有公共卫生疫苗，包括寨卡疫苗和尼帕疫苗。这些是我们正在尝试的各种病毒靶点。当然，我们必须克服许多不同类型的障碍。 这里当然包括新冠肺炎疫苗有迅速出现的变体，这是一个很大的挑战。还有同样有很多抗原漂移的流感疫苗，你需要每年对疫苗进行修饰。对寨卡病毒来说，怀孕期间的畸形、神经畸形和抗体依赖性增强杀伤效应，当然会造成问题。HIV 当然与快速突变有关，也与蛋白聚糖屏蔽关键表位有关，这使得配置疫苗非常困难。对于呼吸道合胞病毒 RSV 疫苗来说，不幸的是，RSV 疫苗的一些后期阶段的研发没有取得成功，而且已经有了一些非常有效的重组疫苗了。埃博拉病毒疫苗目前大部分是 FDA 批准的疫苗，需要零下80度的储存温度。还有一个问题，目前没有埃博拉病毒 mRNA 疫苗的临床试验。狂犬病疫苗在感染后几乎100%致死，目前在临床试验当中出现了一定的挫折。我们需要优化狂犬病疫苗的递送工具。对于疟原虫疟疾来说，问题是缺乏表面抗原，再加上寄生虫复杂的生命周期。我们需要针对感染细胞来防止免疫逃逸，这是当前的问题。当然 ，mRNA 疫苗也正用于肿瘤学，包括许多不同类型的癌症，包括辅助黑色素瘤疫苗、辅助非小细胞肺癌、皮肤鳞状细胞癌、肾细胞癌、膀胱癌、PDLE 疫苗和 KRAS 疫苗等等。就优缺点而言，目前 mRNA 疫苗有不同的优缺点。在优点方面，首先，它是非传染性的，也可以开发癌症疫苗，非常的安全，因为它没有传染性，非常的稳定，而且具有长期的稳定性，快速可复制，很容易去工程化生产。如果你想改变抗原，很容易做到。可用于新冠肺炎疫苗，也可以用于流感疫苗，而且很容易进行大规模的生产，也有非常好的诱导 T 细胞和 B 细胞的应答，免疫原性很高，可以快速蛋白质合成，半衰期较短，无卵无细胞生产流程制备，没有不良事件与卵有关，它不与基因组相互作用。这些都是 mRNA 疫苗的主要的优点。就缺点而言，很少有疗效或者没有长期的安全情况报告，而这些报告是我们非常需要的。免疫细胞传感器被激活，未修饰的 RNA 也快速降解。还有细胞外屏障和低效的细胞内逃逸，需要递送工具。这又会引起问题和副作用。我稍后会解释，小分子药物会影响 mRNA 代谢，这些都是潜在的缺点。就疫苗效果而言，我想新冠肺炎 mRNA 疫苗的最佳的研究，当然是我们香港大学的研究。我们开展了这项研究，发现基本上 mRNA 疫苗和灭活疫苗，如果在2022年那个时候注射3次的话，它实际上对死亡和重症提供了非常好的保护，甚至对那些80岁以上的老年人也是如此。这表明疫苗的免疫原性非常强，在预防死亡和重症方面非常有效。类似的 XBB 单价疫苗被证明在不同类型的变异体当中非常有效，而且具有非常好的交叉保护，证明它实际上是非常好的疫苗，特别有效，可以作为加强针。现在我们正在密切的关注与 mRNA 在香港，我们能够非常密切地跟踪全人群当中所谓的不良事件的原因是，香港卫生署拥有覆盖香港全人群的完整的数据库，从前4剂疫苗的注射到去年2023年底都进行了跟踪。我们跟踪了每一位在香港接种了 mRNA 疫苗或灭活新冠疫苗的人群，因此我们能够跟踪香港所有这些患者和不良事件。这是一项全人群的研究。在香港，我们有750万人口，大约有600万的人口接受了第1剂和第2剂疫苗，占比高达95%。超过80%的人口接受了3剂疫苗。这是一项我们观察 mRNA 新冠肺炎疫苗接种后心脏发炎风险的研究。这是一项自身对照病例系列和病例对照系列。我们使用香港的电子病历和疫苗接种记录，观察到新冠肺炎疫苗接种后28天内的心脏发炎的发病率。从2021年2月到2022年3月，共试用了890万剂的 BioNTech 即德国生物新技术公司的疫苗和610万剂科兴疫苗。我们系统检测到接种 BioNTech 疫苗后心脏发炎的情况在上升。正如你在这里可以看到的，红色的条柱就是 BioNTech 疫苗，蓝色的是科兴疫苗，其中一条是基线，与 BioNTech 疫苗相关的心脏发炎的风险上升。第1剂后15天至28天内的风险比为 4.48， 第2剂后1至14天的风险比为 10.81。第2剂后15至28天的风险比为约3倍。第3剂后14天的风险比约为 4.72。对于科兴疫苗来说，并没有出现显著上升的风险。就疫苗接种情况而言，高风险当然与30岁以下的人有关。BioNTech 疫苗风险会增加，第2剂疫苗的风险当然更高，尤其是心肌炎的风险会增加，而 BioNTech 疫苗有关的心包炎的风险略有增加。总的来说，在所有3剂 mRNA 疫苗接种后28天内检测到心脏发炎的风险增加，但总的来说，与基线期相比，第3剂后的风险不高于第2剂。毫无疑问，我们需要继续监测 mRNA 和灭活疫苗接种之后的情况，尤其是 mRNA 疫苗随后的加强针，尤其要进行监测。我们也特别关注青少年接种 mRNA 疫苗后的不良事件，因为我们发现了心肌炎风险的上升。这是一项队列研究，着眼于青少年的疫苗接种后的总体的不良事件。总体而言，在2021年至2022年期间，香港有27000名青少年在香港接受了第1剂疫苗，大约有23000名青少年接受了第2剂疫苗。总体来说，非常重要的是， 该研究发现，在该队列中，尤其是心血管系统的风险增加。当然，最重要的是，该组中心律失常的风险增加了，而且在接种2剂疫苗之后，心肌炎的风险上升了，风险比达到了29.61%。在接种2剂疫苗之后，心肌炎风险上升，心律失常的风险是略增，风险比为1.97。其他的一些风险包括睡眠障碍的风险略有增加，但是除此之外，在青少年当中没有其他风险上升。我们也考虑来去使用动物来开展试验，因为我们对静脉注射 mRNA 疫苗之后的心肌炎的风险是特别的感兴趣的。我们利用小鼠模型，在使用小鼠模型的 mRNA 疫苗接种当中，我们能够在该小鼠模型中发现，静脉注射1到2次，我们发现与肌肉注射相比，在小鼠模型当中，静脉注射 mRNA 疫苗发生心肌炎的风险会增加。好，那么这里是对照组，这是 mRNA。那么大家可以看到，我们的肌肉注射还有静脉注射相比，与肌肉注射的 mRNA 疫苗相比，静脉注射的 mRNA 疫苗，你可以看到，在小鼠模型中5次注射之后，基本上出现了非常严重的心肌炎，这当然是我们特别担心的事情。我们观察了1次静脉注射，同样建议在注射 mRNA 疫苗之前，要将注射器的注射回抽，从而降低静脉注射 mRNA 疫苗的风险。我们又观察了全人群当中的贝尔氏麻痹症的情况。众所周知，贝尔氏麻痹症与各种疫苗接种相关。这项研究基本上包括了所有16岁以上的人，他们在 mRNA 疫苗接种后28天内被新诊断为贝尔氏麻痹症。这些人是来自香港的电子病例，是从21年到22年，一共有54人在 BioNTech 疫苗接种后在 BioNTech 疫苗接种后28天内被诊断为贝尔氏麻痹症。贝尔氏麻痹症的总体的风险为每10万剂 1.58。总体的病例对照分析显示， BioNTech 疫苗接种和贝尔氏麻痹症之间存在着显著的相关性，但是风险相对来说还是比较低的。在病例对照当中，第2剂BioNTech 疫苗接种后，总体风险比为 2.32。总体来说呢，是存在着风险的，但是绝对风险相对较低。同样，我们需要密切监测后续的加强针。我们还研究了 mRNA 和灭活疫苗患者的甲状腺的功能。我们相信 mRNA 疫苗和灭活疫苗在15天的风险期内与甲状腺功能障碍无关。女士们、先生们，我们的结论是 mRNA 疫苗可以很容易来实现工程化，允许非常迅速的疫苗抗原更新，是针对各种类型的病毒感染甚至细菌感染的预防性疫苗，甚至 可以研发成为抗癌 mRNA 疫苗，具有高免疫原性，而且非常的有效。但是与脂质纳米颗粒，特别是相关的心脏不良事件，是一个我们尤其需要特别关注的问题。尤其是在青少年当中，目前对其机制了解甚少，我们确实需要长期的安全性数据，尤其是对患有潜在的自身免疫性疾病的患者来说，要特别的关注。同时，还有累计剂量的 mRNA 疫苗接种后的未知风险，也需要我们进一步的关注。因此，我们需要对这些不同类型的 mRNA 疫苗接种进行长期随访。好的，我就讲这么多，非常感谢各位的聆听。我希望大家在海南的会议取得圆满成功，希望大家能够享受海南的美丽的风景和美丽的沙滩。谢谢大家。
因为时间有限。前是 WHO 中心，主要是在 Mount Green 进行研究，主要是关注在墨尔本的这流感疫苗的研发。之后呢，我们又到 Quebec 城市的疫苗研究中心来进行研究。我们大家都知道，一共包含4种类型 A、B、C、D。A 和 B 甲型和乙型是流感的2个类型，即甲型 H1N1、H3N2 和2种乙型流感谱系病毒会导致季节性的流感。最近的一次是自2020年以来一直没有在流行的这种超级流感病毒，特别是只有甲流病毒引起的大流行。在这张图表当中，我们可以看到基因组由编码1种或多种蛋白质的8个基因片段组成，2个主要的蛋白质就是疫苗开发的关键蛋白质，就是血凝素和血红素。除此之外，还有很多其他的重要的蛋白质，包含 M2 蛋白和核蛋白。我们稍后会做更加细节的讲解。关于流感疫苗是它的研发非常重要，因为它可以进一步改变人们的致病机理。首先，它是能够改变自身的抗原性，他们通过2种机制中的一点来做到这一点。一种就是能量漂移，即表面蛋白主要是 HA， 但也包括亚型内的神经氨酸酶的影响，逐渐来进一步改变，导致针对先前毒株的抗体无法中和新的病毒。我们看一下，这种基因漂移是汉娜基因突变的一个结果。那基因的漂移，它通过在几天内对血清素和尿液进行测序，可以监测这种基因漂移，但遗传漂移、基因漂移并不总是能够调整这种状况。这里我们展示的是一个例子，主要展示的是NH3 呢这种基因漂移有多严重，它是能够看到 它是一个持续的一个病毒的一个演进。在右手边的这张图片，我们看到的是基因图谱，它是一个时间序列表，也通过颜色来每个区域进行标记。我们可以看到，在共同循环的 H3N2 病毒中有新的一些基因，这些病毒的循环是不均质的，所以在考虑流感疫苗应该包含哪些成分的时候，这个研究就非常重要。甲型流感病毒改变的另一个时机是这个抗原的转移，这是将一种全新的血凝素或神经氨酸酶亚型引入人类群体当中。这种情况发生于甲型流感病毒的时候，而不是乙型的这个流感病毒当中。这是因为甲型流感病毒存在于不止一种宿主中，它有流感的天然宿主 A 病毒存在于已鉴定的16种亚型的这种图谱当中。我们也看到，像不同的亚型也会有不同的影响。最近我们刚刚发现的亚型是在蝙蝠当中，就是 H17和 H18，这也是我们观察神经氨酸一种亚型的时候，我们还没有完全理解这些病毒所造成的疫情的威胁。我们现在有11种不同的亚型，2种是在蝙蝠当中鉴定出来的。除此之外，在其他的在宾鸟和瀑布鸟当中，我们也鉴定出了其他的9种亚型。相比之下，只有2种亚型导致了人类的这种病毒的爆发。如果我们回顾在过去的100多年里，我们看到的是疫情是不断的爆发。在过去的100多年里，我们看到，比如说 H1N1 病毒以及 H3N2 病毒等等，之后又是1969年的 H3N2 病毒 ，H1N1 病毒又在77年又爆发，之后在2009年，我们又看到一种新的 H1N1 病毒的一个变种。在这些新的亚型病毒爆发的过程当中，出现了抗原的漂移，所以在我们考虑到季节性的流感，我们看到主要是 H1N1、H5、H3N2 这种病毒，它们是随着时间的漂移、抗原漂移的一些病毒。那么在自然库当中有哪些病毒呢？我们看到它们有很多基因的变化，同时也有很多每个病毒的多元性，它们都是影响不同的群组。这张幻灯片主要展示的就是H5N1 的流感病毒如何是在人类当中爆发之后，又在鸟群当中进一步引入到人类。这里我们是有 2.3.4.4， 这个是我们比较关注的一个病毒类型，它导致了美国哺乳动物的感染，19种不同的母乳动物感染了大约145起单个的个体事件，但是现在整个证据有限。但是这种病毒的感染不仅仅局限于美国，在很多世界上的其他国家也做了这类的研究，比如说欧洲和南美洲都是有很多哺乳动物的感染。最近的报告呢是比较令人担心的，这是高致病性禽流感 H5N1 病毒进入到这些奶牛的身体上，这也是美国的一个情况。这张图片主要展示的是受这些病毒影响的各个州。我们也知道，它主要是因为牛群的运动和迁移所导致的一个爆发。关于流感病毒疫苗的关键挑战就是病毒之间的巨大的遗传多样性，甚至是这种季节性流感病毒也是如此。比如说像甲型流感病毒，它们是动物宿主，如果出现抗原的漂移和变化，就会让病毒进一步逃脱先前的免疫，并且潜在的给疫苗对感染的保护和对上呼吸病毒的复制保护是有限的。我们目前也看到，在严重疾病和死亡的一个预防上，是往往具有很强的毒株特异性。 另外一个重要的挑战就是我们需要很长的时间才能够研发和使用疫苗，而这些疫苗在弱势群体当中并不像我们想象的那样行之有效。我们也都知道，比如说禽流感病毒的免疫原性是低于季节性的流感病毒，所以疫苗接种的主要目标，比如说流感病毒，就是要实现广谱的免疫，要有效的对抗当前传播的病毒株，以及未来变体，并且要进一步预防在动物中传播的这种病毒，这样不会带来动物或者人体的这种疫苗威胁。我们要进一步严防大病和这个死亡现象。我们希望在理想的情况下预防，来测试疾病，来停止它的传播。这就意味着我们必须要有效的并且病毒疫苗来进行有效的控制。当思考流感疫苗的时候，我们需要系统性的抗体，并且能够保护我们的下呼吸道等等，比如说 SARS-1、SARS-2都是这种病毒。除此之外，我们也看到在小鼠模型当中的潘瑟直肠病毒，像这种，我们希望能够对上呼吸道进行保护它的黏膜 IgA， 但是我们很难来进一步诱导出这些抗体，也很难对它们进行测量。除此之外，还有 T 细胞的一个应答，它是非常长期的一种应答，它能够提供 CTC 的 B 细胞的抗体 ，CD8 细胞清除流感病毒感染细胞。所以，当我们考虑到流感疫苗的保护范围的时候，这里有一个图表，这是一个三角形的图片，就是目前获得许可的疫苗在预防严重疾病方面再次发挥非常好的作用。同时呢，它的致死率往往是具有严格的特异性，所以随着我们将这种保护扩大到通用疫苗，我们获得许多亚型的这种特异性的分析，一个亚型内的通用的这种适用性疫苗。除此之外，开发这种通用性的流感疫苗有两种方法，一种就是循序渐进的方法，就是一步一步的改善呼吸系统，或者是做出一些非常新颖的研发，比如说通过流感疫苗的病毒靶点是血凝素，我们可以观察全场或 HA 干细胞、神经氨酸酶、M2 蛋白或 NP 蛋白，这些病毒呢可以通过流感疫苗不同的机制，比如说像抗体与 T 细胞方面发挥重要的作用。那这里我简单的给大家介绍一下 HA 干细胞的表位，这也是最令人振奋人心的一个靶点。首先，血凝素是一种发光的物质，在这个图片当中，我们看一下所有的这些亮色都是可变的这种残留物，黄色中是一些干细胞中高度保守的表位，所以我们的想法就是要直接诱导对干细胞抗体的免疫，来进一步指导和应答，并进行诱导保护。我们采取了很多不同的方法，一种是直接切下头部，然后获得一个无头的 HA。如果你没有免疫优势的头部，那么免疫应答会直接针对干细胞。另外一种方法就是制造一个嵌合体，就是你不断的改变它的头部，保持同样的颈部。这样的话，随着免疫细胞反复的看到这些颈部，你就会诱导一个非常强大的应答。另外一个我们广泛使用的方法就是要制造这种纳米粒子，这些纳米粒子呢是带有铁蛋白的颗粒，可以镶嵌纳米颗粒，或者可以在一个载体上显示许多不同的表位，这样就可以进一步进行诱导。我们现在已经在 HA 这个颈部干细胞上来进一步探索。那么我们哪些主要的策略呢？主要的策略就是混合不同的抗原，这样就可以把它们进行不同的和 HA 的组合。我们可以通过优化计算来进一步制造广泛应答的这种抗原。我们可以进一步重复所有的序列数据之后，通过覆盖 HA 上 所有随时间变化的斑点，来制造出一种广泛的这种反应性抗原。你也可以将一个非常保守的区域，比如说双镜螺旋或 HA 镜，或者在非点病例中呈现给双镜螺旋的这种态势。在疫情的过程当中呢，我们都进一步学到了关于修饰核酸疫苗的知识。我们仍然可以非常依赖并且可以纯化以纳米颗粒形式存在的蛋白质疫苗，比如说我们可以是载体疫苗、灭活病毒疫苗以及活病毒疫苗和病毒样颗粒。这里也展示了一些非常重要的平台，都是2020年的一篇评论，来自莱莫比特帕莱西的后续文章，再次向我们展示了人们试图诱导广泛交叉反应免疫的各种方法。如果我们看一下 SEED 网络，在 SEED 网络上，它也是有一个列表，就是在研发过程当中的普氏疫苗的一个研发过程。现在大约有一些疫苗的研发过程，有的是在临床前的阶段，有的是进入到了1期、2期、3期的临床阶段。但是不幸的是，截止目前没有一个获得批准上市，但是有很多疫苗都在临床的过程当中，同时有很多疫苗的开发者和6个不同的平台都在参与当中。如果我们看一下在通用流感疫苗开发的平台，我们就会发现他们从临床前1阶段、2阶段、3阶段之后到获批上市，都列出了很多不同类型的疫苗，都是通过不同的平台来进行探索研究。比如说有很多重组疫苗，以流感疫苗为主，有载体疫苗，有病毒样颗粒疫苗，非 LP 的金属颗粒疫苗，用于核酸的疫苗等等。这是一个非常活跃的研究的领域，这也非常值得关注。科学是极其令人兴奋的。简单的介绍一下 mRNA 和重组蛋白疫苗，因为我们习惯于针对季节性流感，我们习惯于考虑灭活疫苗和重组疫苗以及减毒活疫苗的一些用途，但是整个 mRNA 疫苗的过程是短很多。我们认为这包括在实验室检测病毒，并对其进行测序，制造出 mRNA 作为体内流感 HA 或 NA 的编码，并且可以制造出 mRNA 的疫苗。对于重组疫苗与基于鸡蛋的疫苗不一样，我们可以使用生物反应器来制备重组蛋白疫苗。最后，我想用这张图片结束我的演讲。这里面主要展示的是全球流感疫苗的一个供应情况。这是我从 Chris Chen 那里获得的一张幻灯片，他是世界卫生组织的同事。他在这里面指出了季节性流感疫苗的一些剂量，并且他们在一些这个中度严重性的这个疫情过程当中可以发挥的作用。我们看到这里大部分都是灭活的流感疫苗，一小部分是来自减毒活疫苗或重组疫苗。同样，在2019年的大部分疫苗是可以进一步未来在细胞这个培养当中。
通过您的介绍，让我们进一步的了解到了通用流感疫苗的情况。好，接下来有请郝立新，他是来自中国疾控中心的。郝立新先生，他是中国疾病预防控制中心免疫规划中心公众沟通和健康教育室主任。
An editorial board member of Chinese Journal of Vaccine and Immunization. Okay, the title of his report is Influenza and COVID-19 vaccination in China, raising awareness and addressing vaccine hesitancy. Welcome.
Dear experts, good morning. It's my great honor and pleasure to attend this 2024 World Influenza Conference. I'm going to deliver a presentation on influenza and COVID-19 vaccination in China, raising awareness and addressing vaccine hesitancy. I'm going to lead you to review some problems that have happened, in particular related to vaccine hesitancy with vaccination of influenza and COVID vaccines. And mainly, I will focus on vaccine hesitancy. How should we raise people's awareness and address this problem? In China, we have such a big population, and China did a great job in COVID prevention and control. In particular, China has such a big population, and every day we had to get so many people vaccinated during COVID. And China's practice was very successful, but there were some problems. In particular, some special groups of people, in particular the elderly. Vaccination with these people had certain problems. And during the process of vaccination for COVID, we overcome some problems related to vaccination, in particular, vaccine hesitancy. And in 2021, during our survey, at that time, vaccination already started. We conducted this online survey. And you can see that the prevalence of COVID vaccine hesitancy was 15.6% in our study. And among different groups of people, the illustration of vaccine hesitancy was different, but still there was vaccine hesitancy among different groups of people. And among the public health professionals, during the COVID-19, we told people had to get vaccinated. And still among the public health workers, there was vaccine hesitancy too. And the data was released. The study found that 10.7% of public health workers were hesitant to get an influenza vaccine. And some other studies were conducted. And here you can see the study conducted by Jiangwan, etc. According to these studies, different groups of people had vaccine hesitancy with vaccination of flu vaccine. So people had a different knowledge, willingness, and vaccination behavior towards influenza vaccine. some people understand and know the vaccines, but some people may not have knowledge of vaccines. And people had different willingness to get flu vaccine. So there was big gaps among people with knowledge of vaccines and willingness. Some people knew the influenza vaccine and some didn't, and some were willing to get the influenza vaccine and some were unwilling to get them. And very few people really know the influenza vaccine. And some people are willing to get flu vaccine, but they may not actually get vaccinated. And people have concerns about influenza and influenza vaccines. And the most important concern is that in China, among the general public, we couldn't differentiate cold from flu. And people think that epidemic flu is equivalent to cold. So people's understanding of the harm and severity of flu is inadequate. And some people think that influenza vaccine is of no use. In particular, in the post-COVID era. And during the COVID era, some people had similar feelings about COVID-19 vaccine. They thought that the COVID-19 vaccine was not useful or effective. So we have different types of vaccines with different effects. We have very effective vaccines against measles. But for influenza and COVID-19, the vaccines can protect us against death and severe diseases. Maybe they are not very effective against infection, but they are effective against heavy serious diseases and death. So we have to raise people's awareness about the effectiveness and the role of influenza and COVID vaccines. But for COVID-19 vaccination, the vaccination rate was pretty high. We had great policies of advocacy, and we have got very valuable lessons from COVID-19 vaccine communication and advocacy. First, we conducted effective advocacy campaigns among different groups of people. There was a strong leadership in COVID-19 vaccine advocacy, and there was a good mechanism for the vaccine advocacy, and we had the mechanism of multi-sector collaboration and cooperation. We had the joint prevention and control mechanism with different sectors and departments engaged in it. So it was easier to mobilize people to get vaccinated. We also conducted the health promotional activities and educational events and conducted media communication. During COVID-19, we organized a lot of press conferences and many Q&A sessions and expert interviews to raise people's awareness of COVID-19 vaccine. And these strategies helped us overcome vaccine hesitancy. And around COVID-19 vaccination, the national governments, provincial and local level governments developed a lot of posters and publicity materials and documents, and they used the social media and expert interviews to get the messages heard by the general public. And the press conferences were organized to answer people's questions. All of these publicity and advocacy strategies and measures helped us overcome vaccine hesitancy and raised people's awareness. And about influenza and COVID-19, we should prevent them simultaneously. During COVID-19, we were worried that people might mix up flu with COVID-19. And here you can see influenza vaccination. There is great importance attached by the Chinese government to it. At the policy level, there is the Healthy China Action and the Healthy Plan, which advocates and promotes influenza vaccination. There is also technical guidance and support for influenza vaccination. Every year, a technical guidance on influenza vaccination is released by China CDC. So it is an annual publication. It is very effective in raising people's awareness of the importance of getting vaccinated against the influenza. To overcome vaccine hesitancy, a lot of activities were conducted 6 to 7 years ago, together with other countries. China designated the World Flu Day. Many activities and conferences were organized, posters were developed, and many publicity activities were organized to raise people's awareness of flu. And before the flu season or during the World Flu Day, the experts educated the general public and mobilized the general public. But we have to think about the difficulties and problems. Are those publicity campaigns effective in overcoming vaccine hesitancy and raising people's awareness? Recently, I have seen the hierarchy of effects model and the flu awareness campaign, in particular in terms of advertisement placement, to prevent a disease or to prevent some illnesses and raise people's vaccination. We can place some advertisements for vaccination. It is a kind of behavior. And the form of this habit may take some time. So we have to have the whole process approach in the mobilization and the publicity campaigns. So there must be the whole process support to overcome vaccine hesitancy, or else maybe only people's awareness of influenza vaccination is raised, but they may not turn their increased awareness into vaccination behavior. So when we mobilize people to get vaccinated, we have to have priorities and focuses at each different stage. And there must be the whole process evaluation of our publicity effect. In the prevention and control of infectious diseases, the foreign countries have utilized those marketing and communication theories to get better communication effect. In Europe, they have their own publicity campaigns starting from 2013. I think we can learn a lot from those European practices. So they have developed some advocacy models. Now I'm going to talk more about vaccine hesitancy. This is a pretty old problem. First, let's look at the definition. And with all conditions in place, some people still refuse vaccination or delay vaccination. That's the early definition. But now, WHO has realized that vaccine hesitancy is related to motivation. Vaccine hesitancy is related to some social factors. So a framework for understanding vaccination and vaccination behavior was released. So we have to take into account people's psychological states in vaccine hesitancy. And there are near-term and long-term damages from vaccine hesitancy. For the short-term damage, of course, there is low vaccination resulting from vaccine hesitancy, and the long-term damage will be higher incidence of diseases. And here you can see the 3C models of vaccine hesitancy. First, the complacency. Some people think that I'm pretty healthy. I'm so far away from getting a disease. I don't have to get vaccinated. I don't need it. So that's complacency. Second is about convenience, access to the vaccine, and also the price, the cost of the vaccine. If it is too expensive, people may not want to be vaccinated. Another C is confidence, which is the most crucial issue. The general public may not have high confidence in the medical staff who vaccinate them, and they do not have high confidence in the efficacy of the vaccine. So there is a perception gap between the public health workers and the general public. For example, about the accidental events and side effects. The healthcare workers may know them very well, but the general public may not. So we have to bridge this gap and minimize this perception gap. More educational activities are needed to get the general public educated. There are certain principles for risk communication. Altogether, 6 principles: communication, message, the general public empathy, the risk effect ratio, and concise information delivered to the general public. These are the principles of communication. With effective communication, we can combat vaccine hesitancy. The general publicity campaigns target at the general public, but we must have effective approaches to combat vaccine hesitancy. To overcome vaccine hesitancy, an effective assessment and evaluation tool is needed. We shall not simply borrow the international evaluation tools. We need a good scale of assessment. And we need an effective channel of communication. A lot of things are being done. For example, the communication instruments and tools, and the persuasive communication and motivational interviewing, etc. And also our rhetorics. We must have the right rhetorics. So we have the traditional rhetorics and narratives to persuade people to get vaccinated. So we have to work on communication approaches. Next one is community engagement. During COVID, a lot was done about community engagement. And during the COVID period, we had the vaccinated hotels and public places, which were only open to people who were vaccinated. And we have to remove misinformation and disinformation and provide incentives for people to get vaccinated. Finally, I think to overcome vaccine hesitancy, we need engagement of people at different levels. At the end of last year, a guidance was released by the government according to which the publicity and educational competence of public health workers must be enhanced. Without a higher capacity, they just passively do their work. In addition to increasing their competence, I think the grassroots level vaccination health workers must be competent enough to educate the general public. And those public health care workers must have a higher awareness of the importance of vaccination themselves. And they have to be willing to educate people, to persuade people to get vaccinated. If those public health workers hesitate in persuading and convincing people to get vaccinated, of course, we won't have a great vaccination rate. So those are my ideas and the work done in overcoming vaccine hesitancy. And just for your reference, thank you.
For his insightful talk about encouraging the vaccine uptakes. So the next speaker is Joseph Bercy. He is the Director of Respiratory Virus Prevention and Preparedness at the Task Force for Global Health. So today he is going to talk about improving seasonal influenza vaccination can benefit vaccine distribution in pandemic response in lower income countries. Without further ado, let's have the video from the speaker. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Joe Brzee. I'm going to talk about improving seasonal influenza vaccination programs and how they benefit a pandemic vaccine response. The talk will be in 4 parts to answer the question, do seasonal influenza vaccination programs in low-income countries actually benefit vaccine responses during a pandemic? We'll focus on low and middle-income countries, but the data are really true for all countries. The talk will be in 4 parts. First, we'll talk about the components of an influenza vaccination programs to answer the value proposition. Why does it matter? Second, we'll talk about data from the 2009 pandemic. What did we learn? And then we'll apply that to the experience from the COVID-19 pandemic and look for factors associated with pandemic readiness, at least in terms of vaccination. And were influenza programs helpful during the last pandemic? And finally, we'll talk about how this can be used to prepare for the next pandemic. What data are critical? What data should we learn from? So first, we'll start with a sort of a cartoon version of how I see pandemic vaccines being developed. First, there's the detection of the strain. Second, that strain is made into vaccine candidates. Third is that vaccine candidate is produced and distributed around the world. Next, the vaccine programs are implemented in countries and evaluated in those countries. I mention this because the first 3 steps are really the purview of global partners, of large governments and industry. But the fourth and fifth steps, the final steps, are really the purview of national governments completely. And that's important because in those steps, for effective vaccination programs to occur, the national government must be able to do lots of things and do them well and do it in a timely way. They have to have regulatory expertise. They have to have vaccine policy and effective NITAGs to make that policy. They have to have distribution systems to access the vaccines. They have to maintain high vaccine acceptance in the populations for which the vaccine is directed. They have to monitor programs for adverse events, for vaccine coverage, for wastage. They have to have the data systems to get data quickly, and they have to have a trained workforce to be able to implement the vaccine programs effectively and in a timely manner. All those systems must be capable and ready to access adult populations and conduct national campaigns right when the vaccine is ready. And in fact, influenza vaccines are great tools for pandemic vaccine preparedness, mainly because they do three things well. Seasonal influenza vaccination programs target the same risk groups likely to be targeted during pandemics: health workers, people with chronic diseases, older adults, children, pregnant women. All are targeted every year by seasonal vaccines as they would be during a pandemic. Second, influenza vaccination programs during seasonal vaccine programs are conducted annually. Therefore, countries constantly maintain systems for pandemic vaccination, so maintain practice in those systems every single year. And finally, if you vaccinate these groups every single year, the vaccine acceptance in those groups goes up. So during a pandemic, you're likely to have greater demand, greater acceptance, less hesitancy of a pandemic vaccine because the populations are used to being vaccinated in the public health systems. And in fact, this was known a long time ago and has been talked about for decades. In 2003, the World Health Assembly passed a resolution, WHA 56.19, and advised member states should establish and implement strategies to increase influenza vaccination coverage of all people at high risk, and urge these countries to develop pandemic plans for use of vaccines based on the influenza vaccine programs. Since 2003, that same guidance has been issued in a variety of global action plans, pandemic influenza plans, SAGE recommendations, etc., all echoing the same sentiment, that the lack of seasonal programs threaten pandemic response, that pandemic response is enhanced by the presence of seasonal influenza vaccination programs to build the pandemic response. What did we learn from 2009? There were nice data in this study by Porter et al., published in Vaccine right before the last pandemic actually, that showed that countries with seasonal influenza vaccination programs were able to respond more quickly to during the pandemic and get the H1 vaccines out more quickly and more completely. And you see these data listed here. I recommend everybody look at this table because it takes data from lots of countries during the 2009 pandemic, distills them down, and looks at the factors most relevant to a timely and complete pandemic response. And they found, of course, that seasonal vaccination programs were the largest contributor to a timely pandemic vaccine response. The other thing we learned is in reviews of the pandemic responses from various countries and various regions that pandemic vaccine didn't get to low-resource countries until much after it got to high-resource countries. In a report of the WHO after the pandemic, they reflected that lack of existing public sector influenza vaccine programs was a barrier to rapid deployment of pandemic vaccines. And what you see, of course, is that the same things that had to be in place for pandemic vaccine delivery are the same things a few slides ago that I showed you that seasonal vaccine programs are good at building. In a review done by Alba Maria Ropero from Palo at the time, she looked at the response in Latin America during the pandemic and again found that existing high-quality seasonal influenza vaccination plans were used to implement pandemic vaccination programs in the countries that they were robust in. The pandemic target groups were the same, and the number of vaccines available were actually less, and the time to availability was longer for low-income countries that had less developed seasonal influenza vaccination programs. They concluded in this regional review of multiple countries that countries should have pre-established pandemic influenza vaccination operational and logistical protocols based on seasonal influenza vaccination programs. Similar reviews were done in Brazil, which found that the pandemic demonstrated that the best preparation begins with prevention of seasonal influenza vaccination program. And the efforts they used to build those programs were important in pandemic vaccine delivery. A review of African countries by WHO also found that promoting seasonal influenza vaccination programs was a critical help to respond effectively and rapidly to the next pandemic. So what did we learn this last pandemic? Well, we learned much the same. In a review of countries that were part of the Partnership for International Vaccine Initiatives, PIVI, we found that the countries in the partnership, which are about 25 countries, were able to easily adapt the influenza microplans they developed for influenza in service of the COVID. The same priority groups were targeted, so it was easy to identify where the vaccine should be distributed and how much should be distributed in each place. They're experiencing cold chain of vaccine delivery sites were employed in COVID. They used the same data management systems for COVID that they used for influenza. They had experience in addressing the legal and procurement barriers, so that was not a slowdown during COVID. They built on the influenza engagement plans for high-risk target groups that made it easy to increase acceptability and demand. They had trained workforces of health workers. They were able to modify their influenza training courses for COVID, and they were able to use the knowledge, attitudes, practice protocols for survey to understand how they were doing during COVID. Similarly, one of the things we participated in this year with a broad range of partners was a review of COVID vaccine delivery in 20 countries using the WHO COVID post-introduction evaluation tools. And we looked at that. We looked at the COVID enterprise with a particular eye to the value of influenza vaccination programs and their value or not value during COVID. And what most countries reported were, again, not surprisingly, that a lot of the influenza pandemic preparedness plans were repurposed for COVID, that they were able to use influenza programs to reach shared target groups for COVID. They were able to repurpose their microplans so they made delivery efficient, and they adapted the communication plans already developed for influenza for COVID. And you see each of these categories of things on the right side were built by influenza but used during the COVID in each of these 20. They also found that existing vaccine programs for influenza during seasonal positively contributed to demand and generation for COVID-19 among our priority groups. In fact, 50% of the respondents in high priority groups reported that experience with influenza vaccination impacted their decision positively to receive COVID-19. Pernilla Jorgensen in the WHO Europe office in Copenhagen did a study and found that health workers who received influenza vaccines were nearly two times less likely to receive booster doses of COVID vaccines. We also found that staff in countries released reporting AFIs and did so better during COVID if they had done so with influenza. They were better cold chain capacity. And preliminary data shows that countries with influenza vaccination programs during seasonal vaccine had higher rises and greater vaccine coverage of COVID vaccines more quickly during the pandemic. So what are the key lessons? Well, first, that influenza vaccination programs remain relevant and a critical tool for enhancing country readiness for the next pandemic. That the same systems for accessing populations likely to be targeted in any pandemic, like health workers and older adults, are targeted each and every year by seasonal vaccination programs. So the skills in data collection, in communications, in regulatory enterprise, in policy development are all directly transferable from influenza vaccination during seasons to a pandemic vaccine program. That annual campaign planning and implementation done during seasonal vaccination program makes pandemic delivery easier. And that annual delivery increases vaccine acceptance of key risk groups at a time when vaccine acceptance is critical to maintaining a country's vaccine program. Second, that countries with influenza vaccine programs will respond more efficiently and effectively, and that learnings and best practices from these countries should inform countries. So what's to be done? one of the programs that we run in partnership with a variety of other partners around the world is the Partnership for International Vaccine Initiatives. It was established about a decade ago and helps low and middle-income countries develop influenza vaccination programs or other life course vaccination programs to create sustainable respiratory vaccination programs in low and middle-income countries, and uses those programs to build the infrastructure, the capacity, the delivery systems for future influenza and other infectious disease epidemics and pandemics. And we use these countries and this experience to generate and share knowledge from country vaccination for other countries that's relevant. We encourage you to look into PIVI and call us if you have any questions or desire any support. Thank you very much for your attention. And it's been a pleasure to be here sort of with you. I wish I was there in person, but wish you a very productive and informative meeting. Thanks.
Thank you for Dr. Joseph Bracey. Okay, now next, let's look forward to Dr. Margit. Professor Margit is of vaccine epidemiology, head of Department of Infectious Disease, Epidemiology, Dynamics, and the co-director for the Global Health Economic Center of LSHTM. He holds honorary professorships at the School of Public Health, University of Hong Kong, and the Sorsey Hawke School of Public Health, National University of Singapore. The title of his report is Public Health Value Proposition for Vaccines Against Respiratory Tract Infections in Low-Income Countries, from Influenza to Pneumococcal Vaccines. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. And first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about this really important topic at the World Influenza Conference. I'm excited that people are coming together in Hainan in order to speak about influenza vaccines and other key respiratory viruses. And I'm just sorry that I can't actually be there in person because of differing flight schedules, but I'm really delighted to be able to speak about this important topic. I've been asked really to speak about several things. First of all, to talk about public health value propositions, and I'm going to give a bit of background about it. And then I think really talk about different respiratory tract infections, including influenza and pneumococcal vaccines. So what I'm going to do is to split my talk into three sections. First, I'm going to talk about the value proposition concept and how actually over the last 10 years, it has gradually evolved into what WHO are calling the full value of vaccines assessment concept, and explain what this is about. And then I'm going to move on to two case studies about this. The first, quite short, is on pneumococcal conjugate vaccines. And the second, where I'll go into more detail, is about next generation influenza vaccines. So let's start by talking about full value of vaccine assessments and value propositions. Now, I think many of you might be familiar with the idea of economic evaluations. Like you might have heard of cost effectiveness analyses, for instance. What an economic evaluation is about is that it's an evaluation of a certain technology or intervention, such as a vaccine, that compares two situations or two worlds, I would say. It compares a world where you don't have the intervention, the technology, the vaccine, and a world where you do introduce that vaccine technology intervention. And the things you want to compare between these two worlds are, number one, you want to compare the costs, and number two, you want to compare the health effects. And so when it comes to costs, what happens? In a world where there's no vaccination, you still pay a cost. You pay a cost because you have some burden of illness, which the vaccine will prevent. And so if this is an influenza vaccine, then you have the cost of treating people who have influenza. You might also have productivity costs because people with influenza can't work and the family might have to take care of them as well. And so there's some cost to society of less productivity as a result of influenza. Then if you introduce the vaccine, what happens? the cost of illness decreases. So you pay less to treat people, you pay less because fewer people are off sick, so society as a whole is more productive, but you have to pay for something, and that's the cost of the intervention, the cost of buying and delivering the vaccine. So you want to compare the costs of these two worlds. And second of all, you want to compare the health burden, because beyond the cost, people don't like to be sick. It's not something that's desirable. It's something we want to avoid. And so if we decrease the health burden, if fewer people get sick and fewer people die, that is a net gain to society. And so we see that if you introduce the vaccine, the health burden decreases. And so overall, you might say, usually there is an increase in costs when you introduce a new vaccine, but there is a decrease in the health burden. And the question is the decrease in health burden worth the cost? Would we rather be in a world with the vaccine or a world without the vaccine? And that's what a standard economic evaluation, like a cost effectiveness or cost benefit analysis, usually will look at. However, over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of discussions about how we might have to expand the scope of such interventions to cover more impacts. For instance, a paper that I led about almost 10 years ago now picked up some work originally done by Till Bunninghausen, who was then at Harvard University, talking about the broad impacts or the broad socioeconomic impacts of vaccines. The narrow impacts are the ones that traditionally appear in cost effectiveness evaluations, like health gains, health cost savings, and what are called care-related productivity gains. So if people don't get sick, they're able to be more productive. But there are many other benefits of vaccines, and for that matter, other health interventions that are not captured in this. For instance, ecological effects like herd effects, community protection, often is not captured in the models used to evaluate vaccines. Other impacts would be impacts on the wider economy, the macroeconomic impact. If there is a vaccine against influenza, that might boost the economy, not just because people are more productive, but people are able to actually go to the shops more, go to entertainment more, use public transport more. There'll be more tourism, more investment, especially in a pandemic situation. These become important. Household security and equity is another key impact, which we don't often capture in standard economic evaluations, but which is very important to policymakers. At the same time, another group of people led by Brad Gesner was also talking about the brick wall that many vaccines face after they've been through clinical trials, because the clinical trial is focused purely on efficacy, risk benefit, safety, acceptability, cost effectiveness, but there are wider concerns that actually are needed in order to bring the vaccine to the market. What's the effect on health systems, on health security, on outbreaks, on what's the health system impact? What are the wider social and economic benefits? What's the impact on equity and affordability? All these are concerns that policymakers have, but which are not captured in traditional clinical trials and traditional cost effectiveness evaluations. So again, in order to develop the vaccines that are going to jump over this brick wall and be implemented on a large scale in countries, we need to actually start thinking about these. And actually, a lot of work has been going on in the past 10 years to capture some of these broader effects. These are to address different stakeholders across the entire, what's called the full value of vaccines continuum, from the developers of vaccine, academia, industry, R&D funders, like maybe NIH or the Gates Foundation, might want to know, is it worth investing in developing this vaccine? Will we get a good return on that investment? Then when the vaccine is almost introduced, WHO, Gavi, and industry want to know, should we recommend this vaccine? Should we fund this vaccine? And then finally, if there's a vaccine is brought to the market and there's a WHO recommendation, countries and donors still ask the question, should we actually introduce this vaccine into countries? And so as we do these evaluations, they have to address the stakeholders at different points of the continuum. And because there are so many of what are called investment cases or value propositions, so the kind of inputs that, the kind of outputs that come out of these evaluations are really diverse. So this was a review by Soyun Sim who reviewed the different kinds of investment cases, value propositions, and return of investment analyses that looked at vaccines and saw that actually there is a really wide diversity of definitions, outcomes, reporting standards that across all these different sort of evaluations, where different evaluations will report different kinds of outcomes. And in fact, they're called different things, from value propositions to value frameworks to business cases to investment cases. So in the end, some of this becomes more confusing than helpful because there's no standardized guidelines for this. And so actually about 6 years ago, IVRAC, the WHO's Committee on Implementation Research on Vaccines, actually reviewed all this evidence and recommended that there needs to be some standardized approaches and terminologies around value propositions and investment cases. And so that began a process at WHO, and working with academia, working with other stakeholders in funders, industry, to develop some standardized definitions and guidelines for this. And so the early concept was called the full public value of vaccines. So this was a talk by Alejandro Craviato when he was the chair of actually the Product Development Vaccines Advisory Committee at WHO, who pointed out that what's needed is a standardized assessment of the value of vaccines globally, including from the LMIC perspective, low and middle income countries, including the indirect effects of the vaccine, not just on the individual vaccinated, but on the wider community, through herd effects, through the impact on the economy and so forth, to support decision-making across this whole continuum that I talked about. This concept evolved over many iterations. There was a lot of sort of conceptual thinking around it until finally WHO landed on the concept of the full value of vaccines assessment. So this is now developing into a standardized concept. As you can see, there have been several publications led by WHO authors and others in academia and other organizations like like Gavi, for instance, and actually talking about what this means, how these value assessments should be done, and how they could be, what are the opportunities for the future in these values assessments. So what I'm going to talk about is really this concept that WHO is now sort of standardizing, the full value of vaccines assessment and how it would apply to vaccines against respiratory viruses. Just to say that over the past few years, WHO has and other groups have worked on a number of full value of vaccines assessments. So there have been already completed assessments on Group B strep, which was the first one, Group A strep, which followed quite soon after that, new TB vaccines, and then measles, rubella, microarray patches. There are also FVVAs in development on invasive non-typhoidal salmonella vaccines, Shigella vaccines, and what I'm going to talk a bit about later on, next generation influenza vaccines. So this is quite a busy field with lots of activity going on here and lots of stakeholders very interested in this area as well. So let me move on to my two case studies, like I mentioned. The first case study is on pneumococcal conjugate vaccines. The background of all the eggs is not relevant to this. I was thinking of influenza vaccines, but for PCVs, I think most of you know about Streptococcus pneumoniae, and there's been no actual FVVA on PCV vaccines, but that has been a global economic evaluation that was done by Cynthia Chen and colleagues whom I worked with about 5 years ago, that looked at the cost effectiveness of pneumococcal conjugate vaccines across most countries in the world, and really concluded that actually using cost effectiveness thresholds based on health opportunity costs, that means the alternative use of the money that could be spent on the vaccines. Actually, PCVs are cost effective in the majority of countries in the world at expected prices, like something like 80% of countries in the world. The cost actually of vaccinating the whole world at 90% coverage would be about 15 billion a year, but there would be some cost savings which would offset some of that. So not quite a lot of money, but not an incredibly high amount of money. I mean, this was a lot less, for instance, than the money that was used to develop COVID vaccines. Obviously, COVID vaccines have been incredibly important, but actually this is money the world could afford. And the study then went to look at which countries would benefit the most. And not so surprisingly, the countries that would benefit the most from having high PCV vaccine coverage were countries in sub-Saharan Africa, followed by countries in the rest of Africa and South and Southwest Asia. And so actually, really this paper really recommended a faster rollout of these vaccines, especially in these high burden countries. Now, a later study that the same authors then conducted, which is now accepted, but not yet published, but should be quite soon, actually looked at what has happened over the last 10 years, actually over the last 20 years, from the year 2000 to 2019, and concluded that the actual impact of PCVs has fallen well short of the potential that the previous paper saw. Why was that? Because of low coverage and slow rollout. And so these graphs are quite busy, but if you look at the graphs, the purple line, the lowest line, is actually the line that shows the maximum potential that these vaccines could have if they are introduced in all countries. But the other lines show different scenarios about what could actually happen. The actual scenario of what happened up to 2019, and assuming there's no additional coverage after that. And then another scenario which is a bit more optimistic that says, actually, what if in 2019 we managed to increase PCV coverage worldwide to the level of coverage we have for DTP vaccines? Both scenarios would say we've fallen well short of the potential for PCV vaccines, but actually, if we were to accelerate uptake of these vaccines, there could still be a lot of gains in reductions in cases, in deaths, and in DALYs incurred. So that's the story, well, part of the story. This wasn't the full value of vaccines assessment, but part of the story. PCVs have a lot of value, but their potential is not fully reached because of this lack of coverage. The next case study I'm going to look at is looking at next generation influenza vaccines. And so for these vaccines, WHO is working both with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine as well as MMGH Consulting to develop a full value of influenza vaccines assessment for next generation influenza vaccines, which should report its findings probably sometime next year. And so this is actually a study with many work streams looking at global public health needs, stakeholder analyses, the pipeline of the different vaccines, the PPCs, which I'll talk about in a moment, then looking at disease burden, transmission, the impact on the vaccine impact on disease burden, the economic value of the vaccine and what that implies in terms of the market for the vaccine, the return on investment, and the financing streams that are needed for this vaccine. And so this is all based on the WHO preferred product characteristics. So these new next generation influenza vaccines are vaccines that are currently in the pipeline, but will appear hopefully in the future. And so the WHO PPC, preferred product characteristics, which were developed a number of years ago, actually distinguish between two kinds of next generation vaccines: improved influenza vaccines and universal influenza vaccines. So improved influenza vaccines are somewhat better than those we have currently. They might have better protection or better matching, or they might last a bit longer than one influenza season. Whereas universal vaccines would ideally match all strains, including drifted strains, and last for many years. Note that all these definitions and the terminology, the profiles are being actually reevaluated by WHO, and there is a WHO public consultation going on their proposal for a new PPC for these vaccines. So if you are interested, please do go to the WHO site and add your commentary, read the draft PPCs that have been developed and add your comments to it. You can see also the projected year of licensure was rather optimistic. It's 2024 already. We are not yet at improved influenza vaccines, although there are many promising candidates and a long way away from universal vaccines. I mean, the delay is for a number of reasons, including there was a pandemic not so just a few years ago, where really a lot of focus rightly so, was focused on developing COVID vaccines. But I think some of these spin-off developments, such as the knowledge about mRNA vaccines, is definitely going to help the influenza field as well. But, well, what we did then was to take these PPCs and then develop scenarios for mathematical models, which looked at different profiles, different sort of like scenarios that next generation vaccines could have. So we looked at no vaccination, current vaccines, which were expected to have about 70% efficacy in a well-matched year in immunocompetent individuals, and maybe 40% of a poorly matched year, but limited duration of protection, only 6 months. And then improved vaccines, which might have a slightly longer duration or much longer duration or better efficacy, or the sort of, well, the ultimate goal, you know, the universal vaccines, which might have 90% efficacy every season for up to 5 years. So what did that look like? Well, this has been some work, a program of work on the modeling side that has been going on since 2021. And so we've developed these models of the next generation vaccines and actually applied them to cost effectiveness evaluations in Kenya, in the UK, and in Thailand, in discussion with stakeholders in those countries. We're now in year 2, well, phase 2 of the work, which is really looking at extrapolating the results from these 3 countries to the rest of the world, and then looking at the potential global cost effectiveness and impact of these vaccines, which can actually inform the value of these vaccines to funders and developers as well as to countries. And then towards the end of the year, we'll then be actually using these models to support WHO's full value of vaccines assessment and look at other sort of like important outcomes, like look at supply and demand for these vaccines, and look at the impact on, for instance, antibiotic use and antimicrobial resistance, is what is one of these key broader impacts of these vaccines. So some of these papers have been published already. You can see some of references below. For instance, the work on Kenya led by Naomi Waterlow actually found that even under sort of different cost effectiveness thresholds, many of the improved influenza vaccines would be very cost effective, even if current influenza vaccines are less cost effective in a country like Kenya. I mean, Kenya is a challenging situation because there's no distinct season at a fixed time every year. And so a vaccine given at a certain time of the year may miss a lot of the burden, which occurs, you know, more than 6 months after the vaccine is introduced. But as we start to introduce these new vaccines, these vaccines could have a tremendous amount of benefit to the country. You know, they could drastically increase the impact and the value of vaccines as these vaccines gradually get improved. And if you look across the world, the picture is even more exciting, I would say. Like, I mean, this the work that we're doing right now is looking at the threshold costs for these vaccines. What is the value of these vaccines, which would inform how much countries would be willing to pay for these vaccines? And you can see that, you know, as we look at high-income countries, countries might be willing to pay, you know, really several $100 US a dose for these vaccines because they could have such tremendous potential. You could vaccinate one cohort with the sort of most optimistic vaccines and really see no or very little flu for many years. And even in low-income countries, these improved vaccines could have could definitely have value if given to children at the prices that Gabby might be able to well, purchase these vaccines at. So these vaccines really could be cost effective almost everywhere in the world and make a real big difference to the influenza vaccine scene. And so I'm going to end just by some key messages. Apologies, I can't be there to answer questions, but I'm really very happy to, you know, take questions, give your questions to the organizers, or feel free to email me. One is, the first thing is, like, value propositions for vaccines have been very diverse in their reporting of outcomes because they're designed for many different kinds of stakeholders individually. But WHO is now bringing together and standardizing this concept in what they call the full value of vaccines assessment. And already this is pushing forward a lot of FBVAs of different pipeline vaccines. And so looking at 2 sort of case studies, for PCVs, our work showed that these can have a big health impact globally and be cost effective, but we haven't realized this impact yet because of the slow vaccine uptake, despite the fact that they're cost effective. And for next generation influenza vaccines, again, these can have enormous value, especially if they manage to protect across several seasons. So once again, thank you very much for this incredible invitation to speak here, and I hope I'll be able to join you in a future year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing his insightful ideas about the next generation vaccines. So the next speaker is Dr. Wenfei Zhu. She is working in the National Institute for Virus Disease Control and Prevention, China CDC. So today, she's going to talk about very exciting topics about the evaluations of immune efficacy of novel influenza vaccines. Without further ado, Dr. Zhu.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for Professor Lian Pu, and thanks for the invitation. Hello, everyone. I'm Wenfei Zhu from Chinese National Influenza Center, China CDC. It is my great honor to be here to talk about the evaluation of immune efficacy of novel influenza vaccines. You know that influenza is an acute infection that can cause affect all age groups, and is associated with high mortality during pandemics, epidemics, and sporadic outbreaks. The past 4 pandemics has caused about 50 million deaths, and the seasonal epidemics, which include, subtype H1N1, H3N2, and influenza B viruses, can cause 4 million severe infections each year, and about half of, deaths. And the zoonotic influenza viruses, which include swine influenza virus and avian influenza virus, can sporadically, cross the species barrier and infect human. And the zoonotic influenza viruses include the subtype H1, H3, H5, H7, H9, and so on. And amongst all these subtype influenza viruses, the H5 subtype avian influenza virus can cause high mortality rate that is about 50%. So therefore, this subtype influenza virus can cause, many hospitalizations and mortalities. So influenza is considered to be one of the world's greatest public health challenges. Just as WHO Director General Dr. Tedros said that the threat of pandemic influenza is ever present. The ongoing risk of a new influenza virus transmitting from animals to humans and potentially causing a pandemic is real. The question is not if we will have another pandemic, but when. We must be vigilant and prepared because the cost of a major influenza outbreak will far outweigh the price of prevention. So the influenza vaccine is considered to be the most effective method for preventing, the influenza infection and its complications. Since 1930s, many various influenza vaccines have been developed, including inactivated split vaccines, subunit type vaccines, recombinant vaccines, and live attenuated vaccines. And currently, conventional ways by using the embryonate eggs is predominantly used for the influenza vaccines production. But the influenza vaccines efficacy varies each year, based on the circulating influenza strains and the influenza vaccines uptake rates. So a broad spectrum or a universal influenza vaccine are being actively researched. Instead of the globular head of HA protein, which is immune dominant but variable and strain-specific, the novel influenza vaccines mainly target the conserved region of influenza virus, including, the HA stock of the stock region of HA protein, the M2E protein, M1 protein, and the nuclear protein, and all these novel influenza vaccines are preparing by using the viral vector, DNA vector, virus-like particle, nanoparticle, or peptide, which can directly stimulate T cells. Firstly, as for the VLP vaccine, many clinical trials have been conducted for both human and avian influenza viruses. And based on the clinical trial result, the VLP vaccine manufactured by the Medicago company and so on have been reported to reduce both the cross-reactive antibody and the T cell response. So in order to develop a universal influenza vaccine, many strategies have been, documented to improve the efficacy of VLP vaccine. The first is the COBRA strategy. That is the computation-optimized broadly reactive antigen methodology. To develop an effective influenza B vaccine, the COBRA strategy was used to design 3 unique HA antigen strategy, and then these proteins were expressed on the surface of virus-like particle and then used to vaccinate ferrets, and which was pre-immune to BV or BY lineage viruses. And the study showed that the single influenza B virus HA protein designed based on the COBRA strategy can elicit protective broadly reactive antibodies against current and future drifted influenza B virus from both BV and the BY lineages. In another study, the COBRA strategy was used to design influenza HA protein, representing H2, H5, and H7 subtypes. The mice was firstly pre-immune to H1N1 and H3N2 seasonal influenza virus, and then vaccinated with this HA-based vaccine. And the results show that the HA-based vaccine vaccinated mice were fully protected from lesser challenge, but the mock vaccinated mice with or without pre-immunity were not protected from morbidity or mortality. So both results demonstrated that the COBRA strategy can be certainly, promising for improving seasonal influenza vaccines. The next is about the mosaic strategy. In order to develop a universal influenza vaccine, Dr. Shu Yuelong's group from China developed a mosaic strategy to optimize the HA and NA sequence of seasonal influenza virus. They created HA and NA mosaic cocktails containing the majority of T cell epitopes of seasonal virus. And they compared the immunogenicity and the cross-protective effectiveness of this VLP vaccine to the other commercial quadrivalent inactive influenza vaccine in the mice model. And the results show that these mosaic VLP vaccines developed by the Dr. Shu Yuelong's group can induce stronger cross-reactive antibodies and can robust more T cell responses compared to the commercial quadrivalent inactive influenza vaccine. Furthermore, the mosaic VLP vaccines can also provide protections against the challenges with ancestral influenza A virus of H1N1 and H3N2 viruses. So this result demonstrated that the mosaic strategy can be promising for developing a broad influenza vaccine in future. The next is the subunit vaccine. We know that subunit vaccine contains the surface antigen proteins and has better safety profiles than the split variant influenza vaccine. So also in China, a phase 3 double-blind, actively controlled clinical trials was conducted for a novel quadrivalent subunit vaccine. And the results showed that this vaccine had, the adverse reactions after the vaccination was mild to moderate and vanished within 3 days, like fatigue, like a cough, like diarrhea, like vomit, and so on. And no severe adverse reactions was observed. Furthermore, a 2-dose vaccine series has better protection than that of one-dose steroids for the children aged from 3 to 8 years. The next is the viral vector vaccine. We know that viral vector vaccine is a new vaccine platform that relies on the recombinant viruses to deliver the immunogen into the host cell. And the viral vector vaccines contain the viral vectors of influenza virus, RSV, adenoviruses, and so on. And this is the timeline for the viral vector vaccines, which were licensed for use in human. We can see that before 2020, only 5 viral vector vaccines have been licensed for use in human, with 1 by WHO, that is the vaccine for against the Ebola virus. And since 2020, 5 more viral vector vaccines have been licensed for use in human, with 3 by WHO. And all these 5 viral vector vaccines were developed based on the adenoviral vectors. And we know that owing to the COVID-19 pandemic, there is an expansion use of adenoviral vector vaccines, that is AVV, with dose given to billions of people worldwide. So that can give us numerous insights into the efficacy, the safety, the immunogenicity of AVV or AVV technology. And the results show that the AVV can not only, well tolerated and but also elicit strong cellular and humoral immune responses in humans. So viral vector vaccines can provide us an important approach against the emerging infectious disease in future. Dr. Xianing South Group, also from China, developed a COVID-19 vaccine based on a live attenuated influenza virus. And the animal studies show that this vaccine can not only, show rapidly, long-lastingly, and broad protection against COVID-19, but also it is the one vaccine which can protect against both influenza and COVID-19. Furthermore, different from other intramuscular vaccines, this vaccine is a nasal vaccine. We know that the intramuscular vaccine is limited in the local immunity in the respiratory tract, but this nasal vaccine developed by Dr. Xianing South Group can elicit both innate and adaptive immune responses in animals. And the clinical trials show that this vaccine can be well tolerated and the immunogenicity in Chinese adults. And the last is mRNA vaccine. And just as mentioned in the earlier presentation, we know that the mRNA vaccine is an advanced technology vaccine, and it can elicit both, the strong humoral and the cellular immune responses. So mRNA vaccine is considered to be an ideal vaccine platform to develop a vaccine against the emergency infectious disease. And up to now, many clinical trials of mRNA vaccine have been conducted for the emerging infectious disease like influenza. Take Moderna as an example. For the respiratory vaccine, Moderna has developed several mRNA vaccine candidates against the flu and the COVID-19. The mRNA 1010 is the Moderna's vaccine candidate for the seasonal influenza virus, and the mRNA 1283 is Moderna's next generation COVID-19 mRNA vaccine candidates. And the clinical trials showed that both vaccines can elicit, positively, independently positive phase 3 clinical trial data. And another mRNA vaccine, the mRNA 1083, this vaccine, based on the Moderna's announcement last month, this vaccine can show an acceptable tolerability and the safety profile. In addition, it is also the one vaccine which can protect against both influenza and COVID-19, because after vaccination, this vaccine can elicit stronger immune responses compared to other commercial or licensed flu and COVID-19 vaccine. With Chinese National Influenza Center also have made many efforts to develop the mRNA vaccine against the influenza. And up to now, we have developed one kind of mRNA vaccine against the influenza. And my study showed that the mRNA vaccine developed by us can provide full protection against a fatal challenge with seasonal influenza virus like H1N1, BV, or BY viruses. And we all know that mRNA vaccine have great challenges or great advantages than other type of influenza vaccine, but the challenges of mRNA vaccine still exist. Firstly, you know, both the mRNA and the delivery system can alter the adjuvant property of mRNA vaccine. So more efforts should be made to balance the antigen expression and adjuvant effort. Secondly, but not lastly, is about the stability during storage and transportation. We know the quality of a vaccine is highly sensitive to temperature. So the storage and the transportation of the vaccine under a proper temperature range from the production to the administration is very important for the influenza vaccine's efficacy. So more effort should be made to develop a more stable and safer mRNA vaccine. In summary, although many challenges and many considerations have been still exist for the universal influenza vaccine, just to use one line from a Chinese movie, the Wandering Earth, that is, regardless of the outcome for history of mankind, we have decided to choose hope. So we believe that cross-collaborative researchers are warmly welcomed, and in the coming few years, with more evidences of universal influenza vaccines are available, the goal of finally achieving a universal influenza vaccine will not be far-fetched. That's all my presentation. Thanks for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you for Dr. Wenfei Zhu. She drew our attention to the effectiveness evaluation of influenza vaccine. The next speaker is researcher Zhibing Peng. She is head of branch of respiratory infectious disease, Division of Infectious Disease, China CDC. The title of her report is Influenza Vaccine Policy in China, which is a highly anticipated topic. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, moderator, for the kind introduction. I think most of the audience is from China, so I'm going to speak Chinese, and I have English PowerPoints for your reference. Just now, the previous speakers talked about the frontier vaccine research and study. My topic is more down to the earth. Influenza vaccination in China is not so satisfying. And since we have been developing the guide, we have been focusing on the vaccination against the influenza among the at-risk population, and I will mainly talk about influenza vaccination policy in China. 2 parts. First, the review of influenza vaccine effectiveness studies in China and across the world, and then the vaccine immunization strategy. And here you can see meta-analysis and observations. For people engaged in vaccination strategy, the strategy must be based upon evidence. The technical guidelines are based upon evidence collected in China, but we do not have much evidence in China, in particular related to vaccination effectiveness or efficacy. There are many researches on disease burden, including death and emergency hospitalization and outpatients. But for vaccine efficacy, we need more evidence to inform the vaccine immunization strategy. And here you can see our meta-analysis. The methods is test negative design, which is recommended by WHO. And 76 are included in the meta-analysis, and you can see the results related to different subtypes. And for the influenza vaccine, every year, we mainly look at the antigen match. So you can see that the antigen match affects the efficacy of the vaccine. And with a greater match, the vaccine efficacy is better. And for H1N1, H3N2, and the influenza B, as long as there is good match, we can have over 40% of vaccine efficacy. So that's the moderate level of protection, which is acceptable. But with the unmatched seasons, the efficacy is lower. So every year, based upon the global surveillance results, we try to create a better match for higher vaccine efficacy. And we have another publication, and you can see the case types, including outpatients and inpatients. That's the population. And according to many research results, you can see that the influenza vaccine effectiveness on inpatient is slightly higher than that of outpatients from the perspective of case types. And here you can see the same study from the perspective of age groups. With a rising age, you can see for children below 18, and the vaccine effectiveness is higher than the adults. But there is some directional research. And for the elderly people, usually VE is weaker than the healthy adults. But from this study, from the perspective of age groups, the influenza VE is lower in young adults and elderly individuals compared to children. And this is another research. It is about at-risk population. For influenza vaccine, we first recommended to the high-risk populations. And this is a study about the risk of stroke incidence and hospitalization and mortality among stroke patients. The 26 meta-analysis. The 26 publications in the meta-analysis compared to those who haven't received the influenza vaccine, vaccinated patients exhibit a 19% reduced risk of stroke incidence and a 50% reduced risk of mortality. And we have a pretty good evidence chain. So guidelines should promote vaccination for at-risk individuals. And here you can see that the influenza vaccines can reduce the risk of adverse cardiovascular events. So patients who received the influenza vaccine exhibit a 34% reduced risk of adverse cardiovascular events. And here you can see the research targeted at diabetic patients. Diabetic patients aged 18 years and above. And you can see the follow-up monitoring of cardiovascular-related events. So first, the study analyzed the cardiovascular-related risks. And you can see the population results with vaccination. It can reduce all-cause mortality and reduce the risk of cardiovascular death and the risk of AMI stroke death among diabetic patients. Another group of at-risk individuals is people with hypertension. Vaccination was significantly associated with reduced risk of all-cause mortality and reduced the risk of cardiovascular death and reduce the risk of AMI stroke death among patients with hypertension. So this is a great evidence for vaccination among at-risk individuals. So more evidence is provided internationally, but in China, we have less evidence related to pregnant women because very few of our clinical trials target at pregnant women, but there is rich international evidence. So here is the vaccine protective efficacy for pregnant women. You can see the pregnant women diagnosed with influenza. The vaccination rate among the case group was 13%, while the control group had vaccination rate of 22%. So after adjusting for other factors, FAE on hospitalization for pregnant women was 40%. So this is pretty good. So that's the direct protection for pregnant women, reducing the risk of hospitalization because of acute respiratory tract infection. And this is the protection for infants younger than 6 months. For all types of influenza vaccines, they cannot be administered on infants younger than 6 months. But the pregnant women are vaccinated, and we check whether that can protect the infants younger than 6 months. By vaccinating pregnant women, for the infants younger than 6 months, they are protected, and there are reduced risks of exposure. And with reduced month age, the protective effect is higher. So flu vaccination of pregnant women provides 34% VE for infants under 6 months of age and 53% VE for infants under 39% VE against the hospitalization. So there is a free influenza vaccination for people, in particular the at-risk people. And this is the effect evaluation of influenza in Jiaxing, Zhejiang. And the vaccination rate from free vaccination is higher than the out-of-pocket vaccination. So we can have the evaluation for 2022 to 2023 season. The influenza vaccine has a certain protective effect on elderly individuals aged 70 and above. It is recommended to continuously promote free influenza vaccination for the elderly and increase vaccination rates. So these are about the emergency cases and outpatients. China CDC has conducted monitoring and evaluation of VE in Beijing and Zhejiang and Shenzhen, those free vaccination and provinces and regions, including the primary school and secondary school students aged 6 to 18 and elderly individuals aged 60. We started this work in 2019, but later COVID broke out, and only in 2022 and 2023 we see better results, which are more aligned with our evaluation. And here you can see the VE results from 2022 to 2023. The effectiveness of influenza vaccination in preventing outpatient and emergency department visits was 35.1%. And the subgroup analysis showed that the effectiveness of IIV4 influenza vaccination was over 50% for patients aged 13 to 18 and over 60, as well as for patients with underlying diseases. And you can see the high-risk people, and the effectiveness of influenza vaccination against the A subtype influenza virus was 59.8%, and the effectiveness against the AH1N1 and PDM09 subtype influenza virus was 36%. And for age 3 and 2, the effectiveness was 59.8%. That was amazing. Usually, the protection against age 3 and 2 was lower, but according to this study, the effectiveness of vaccination against age 3 and 2 was pretty high, 59.8%. And the effectiveness against the H1N1 was 36.1% in 2023. H1N1 broke out in spring in around March. That was the epidemic peak, while vaccination was mainly in October and September. And H3 and 2 happened in winter in last season, 2022 to 2023. So the epidemic season may affect the monitoring of the efficacy of vaccine. Now let's look at China's influenza vaccine immunization strategy. It is important to develop the protection and vaccination strategies, which must be based upon the disease burden, the safety and efficacy of vaccines. Effective vaccination strategy must be based upon all those factors. And currently, if we look at the vaccination rate in China, generally speaking, it is pretty low. But we have different policy types. For example, free and self-payment, there are huge differences in terms of vaccination rate. The first role is free vaccination, mainly for the elderly. And in Beijing and Shenzhen, the vaccination for primary and secondary school students is free. And the second role, medical insurance reimbursement policy. And the third role, self-payment. So free vaccination is an effective approach to increase vaccination rate. And you can see that every year the vaccination rate is below 5%, but in recent years, there has been significant increase of vaccination rate. Hopefully, with more evidence and greater awareness, we can have a higher vaccination rate. The vaccination policy should be developed. It is necessary to develop the vaccination policy because last year there was the co-circulation of multiple pathogens. We conducted surveillance over multiple pathogens, and for the pathogens with vaccines, it is recommended to get vaccinated. And there is a co-infection which may make the diseases more serious. We have been following the guidance and instructions of WHO, which are based upon high risks of infection and high disease burden. In China, since 2018, the technical guidelines have been developed based upon the risks. In China, the first principle is that for individuals 6 months and above without contraindications should get a flu vaccine. So this is a general recommendation. And for the high-risk groups, they should be vaccinated promptly, including the healthcare workers. They have the exposure risk to risks, and also elderly individuals aged over 60 and above. There is a higher risk of serious disease and death, and chronic patients are the recommended groups, and vulnerable populations and staff in congregate settings such as elderly care facilities, long-term care facilities, and welfare homes. So these are the vulnerable populations who are recommended to get vaccinated, and pregnant women and children aged 6 to 59 months, they have higher risk of infection and hospitalization. And the infants under 6 months of age do not have vaccines available. So family members and caregivers of infants under 6 months of age are the priority groups. And key populations in settings such as kindergartens, primary and secondary schools, and the correctional facilities. So these are the populations, the priority populations that are recommended to be vaccinated. And there are some seasonal differences between the north and the south of China. So it is recommended to arrange vaccination as soon as vaccines are available, preferably before the local flu season, and vaccination services should be provided throughout the flu season. The number of doses for vaccination. So there are recommended doses for people vaccinated and unvaccinated. I mentioned the development of vaccination strategy and policy, which must be evidence-based. Influenza vaccination can bring substantial health benefits, especially for high-risk groups, such as infants, the elderly, and individuals with chronic diseases. In yesterday's conference and in the previous conferences, we can see that the Chinese government attaches great importance to influenza vaccination and monitoring and surveillance, and there is a good evidence support, but vaccination is not ideal. So a lot has been done in surveillance and monitoring, but still vaccination rate is pretty low. There is a stark contrast between a well-functioning influenza surveillance system and China's extremely low vaccine coverage. It is recommended to administer the vaccine as early as possible when it becomes available, especially to promote vaccination among vulnerable and susceptible populations. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Is Dr. Yanwen Jiang. So he is the associate professor in the Sun Yat-sen University School of Public Health. Today, he's going to share his topic with influenza vaccine effectiveness among primary and secondary school students in Shenzhen during 2023 and 2024 influenza seasons. Without further ado, please.
All right. Thanks to Professor Poon for the introduction, and thank you for staying here for this last session of the great event. Actually, I did wonder for a moment why this event was hosted in Hainan, but now I think it makes sense because Hainan and influenza share one thing in common. They are both good reasons to give ourselves a break from work. But today we are not going to take a break. We are going to discuss our work related to influenza VE among school students in Shenzhen. I am presenting this on behalf of our PI, Professor Yuanlong Shu, and our collaborators from Shenzhen CDC. So I will briefly introduce the immunization programs in Shenzhen and quickly cover the study design and implementation of our study. But most importantly, I will present the findings, and I will give some comparisons of our results with similar studies in the literature. So some quick introduction of the immunization programs in Shenzhen. Obviously, we are familiar with the disease burden of influenza. We know this virus is causing hundreds of thousands of deaths worldwide each year and millions of severe cases. We would like to think that all men are created equal, but that's not the case for influenza. There are some subgroups that are at higher risks of both infection and severe cases. There are 5 or 6 such subgroups, but children and older adults are arguably the groups that takes up the largest fractions. So among these, children also possess their own peculiar types of risks. Specifically, over 90% of reported influenza outbreaks in China occur in schools and kindergartens. In Shenzhen, that's also the case. So schools and kindergartens are also the hotspots, accounting for over 95%. These places account for over 95% of total outbreaks of all types of infectious diseases. And among these, primary and secondary schools account for over 70%. Influenza consistently ranks among the top 3 of these pathogens causing the outbreaks. There is a general consensus across all types of government, public health agencies, and international organizations that the most effective way to prevent influenza is to get vaccinated. And that's why we need to have such immunization programs for the vulnerable groups, including children and older adults. So Shenzhen has 2 immunization programs. One for children, for school students in primary and secondary schools, another for older adults aged 60 and above. Shenzhen is not the first city to implement such programs in China. Beijing and Hong Kong started such programs years ago. And Shenzhen did not do this until 2019, but still, to this day, it's among the very few cities that do have such programs. This program has continued uninterrupted for 5 years and did not stop even during the pandemic. As you can see from this chart, so before the implementation of this program, the vaccination rate is as low as 2%. And in the very first season that this program was rolled out, the uptake rate went up to 57% for school students. It's a very remarkable increase. And in the last influenza season, the uptake rate continuously increased to 73%. That's very high. And a reason for this very high uptake rate is that in Shenzhen, the vaccines for students are delivered on site in schools. So nowadays, all districts of Shenzhen implement this in-school delivery mode. But in the very first season, when the free vaccines were provided, different districts used different approaches. Some of the districts asked the students to get vaccinated in community healthcare centers specifically. But some districts allowed public health workers to go into schools and deliver the vaccines. And as you can see, those districts that delivered vaccines on site had much higher uptake rates in general. And so now all districts have converted to the in-school mode of delivery. And because of this high uptake rate, we are able to conduct a vaccine effectiveness study. But you may ask, and you may legitimately ask, why do we still need another study for vaccine effectiveness among students when we already have similar studies in the literature? For example, there are studies in Beijing and Hong Kong telling us whether the vaccines are effective or not each year. I think the answers are at least twofold. So first of all, the patterns of influenza epidemics are not the same across regions. For example, the temporal trend may not be the same. The strains that are circulating may not be the same. China CDC reports influenza activity for northern and southern China mainland separately because of the different patterns. And even though Shenzhen is adjacent to Hong Kong, actually, the strains that are circulating in Shenzhen and Hong Kong can be quite different sometimes. So one of the reasons that we need another study is because of geographic differences in terms of influenza activity. In fact, even to this day, there is no specific evidence on VE for students in the south part of China mainland. And so we are filling this gap. Another reason, which is also obvious, is that influenza virus can be different year to year. It has some substantial variations. You know, Einstein says God does not play dice with the universe, but influenza is not God. Influenza is actually a devil that loves playing the dice. That's why we cannot predict the VE of influenza vaccines very accurately. You know, if someone asks you whether vaccines are effective, it's like hearing the question of whether the stocks are going to rise or fall tomorrow. You cannot give a definite answer. You have to answer with probability, but people usually don't respond very well to probability. So we need some sort of deterministic answers, and we need to speak with data and evidence. And that's what we are providing here. So the study design and implementation of the study, this is relatively straightforward. We have two study objectives. First is to evaluate the VE among students in the past influenza season, and the second is to analyze the VE by subtypes of influenza. So we enrolled students who aged between 6 and 18 in Shenzhen. So the students have to be local students in Shenzhen. And then they present themselves with ILI symptoms in medical facilities, and they will be picked up by clinicians, including physicians and nurses. And based on their ILI symptoms, they are enrolled and their nasopharyngeal swabs are taken. And these specimens are transported to laboratories for tests. So the positive cases are defined as cases, obviously, and the rest of the people are defined as a control group. And their data, their outcome data, are connected to the vaccination records hosted by Shenzhen CDC. And based on the connected data, we can analyze the VE. We enrolled students in two sites, two major hospitals in Shenzhen. One is Bao'an Hospital, which is a big tertiary hospital. Another is Shenzhen Children's Hospital, which is the main hub of clinical care for babies and children in Shenzhen. The study was formally conducted between December 2023 and January 2024. There were two conditions for us to initiate the pilot study. So the influenza positive rate of ILI cases had to reach 5%. Also, it has to be at least 2 weeks since the immunization program in Shenzhen was finished. So these two conditions was met in the last week of November, and we conducted the pilot study in that week, and after that we immediately initiated the formal study. We enrolled students non-stop for the entire week, and we did not stop until we reached the desired sample size. But that did not take very long, it only took 2 months. And the patient consent forms were collected from the guardians. Some questions were delivered as a survey, and these were also transcribed to electronic data. we collected their nasopharyngeal swabs and conducted PCR tests. Of note here, the number of positive cases and negative cases here do not add up to the total specimens we collected, because we also applied some exclusion criteria later on, and some of the students were excluded. So now let's talk about the findings. We enrolled 2631 samples from Shenzhen Children's Hospital and 766 samples from Bao'an Hospital. So most of the samples were collected from Shenzhen Children's Hospital. And there were 3,397 students that were enrolled in total, but we had to exclude some of the students, such as those who took antiviral drugs in the past 7 days, or those who presented with symptoms but had a vaccination less than 14 days ago. We also excluded students from neighboring cities. And some of the students did not have any information in the immunization system, so they had to be excluded as well. Also, some of the students did not meet the strict definition of ILI cases. They were enrolled, they were initially screened, but as you may be able to imagine, everything can be very fuzzy in big hospitals in China. And so the initial screening of the ILI symptoms may not be in line with what we need. So after excluding these cases, we had 2689 students. 761 of these students were influenza positive, and the rest were influenza negative. Among the positive cases, the uptake rate of influenza vaccine was 43.4%. And among the negative cases, the uptake rate was 64.5%. And based on this data, we were able to conduct multivariable analysis. This is a map of Guangdong province and Shenzhen. Although we only collected samples from 2 major hospitals, our samples actually represented all districts. But obviously, they were represented to different degrees. Now, this is a breakdown of the subtypes of the influenza virus. So among the 761 cases, 584 were H3N2. So the positive cases were predominantly H3N2, and 174 were BV. There were also 3 students who were tested positive for both subtypes. And so the overall positive rate was 28.4%. As we mentioned earlier, the uptake rate of vaccines was higher among the negative cases and lower among the positive cases. And so if we take these numbers together, we will get an unadjusted VE of about 58%, and adjusted VE of 57%. So we adjusted for several individual characteristics, but the adjusted and unadjusted VE numbers did not differ too much. And this is the analysis of VE for each subtype. So for H3N2, the VE was about 51% or 52%, and for BV, it was about 75%, and the overall VE was about 58%. So the VE was higher against BV than against H3N2. And this was understandable because if we look at the data reported by China CDC, the match between the vaccine component and the circulating strain was relatively well for BV, but not so well for H3N2. This is the forest plot of VEs for different subgroups. It needs to be highlighted that the VE was better among lower grade students and younger children than among higher grade students and relatively older students. For example, for students who aged 13 and above, or for students who are in secondary schools, the VE numbers were not statistically significant. I think there were at least two factors driving these results. First, our number of samples who were in secondary schools or who were older than 13 were much smaller than primary school students or those who were younger than 13. Second, the VE was indeed not as good as in the younger students. So maybe if we had a larger sample size of the older students, we may get a statistically significant number for the VE estimates, but still the numbers won't, the point estimate will not go up too much. We also did a post hoc analysis, meaning that this analysis was not pre-planned. But we saw that results for secondary school students and those aged older than 13, we wanted to look into the details of the VE for this population. So we did a secondary subgroup analysis, meaning that we looked at the VE against subtypes by subgroups. And it's perhaps worth our attention that the VE against BV among secondary school students is 77%. So although the overall VE for secondary school students is not statistically significant, it's still very well for BV among secondary school students. But apparently the VE against H3N2 among secondary school students is very bad. It's only 13%. It's close to nothing. Now a quick comparison with other studies in the literature. This is the historical data of VE amongst students and children in the US. And there's a general pattern that the VE is indeed better among the younger children than among the older children. And these do equal with our findings. Let's take a look at the data in Beijing. This is the only available set of VE estimates in China mainland. So there's no data for the south part of China mainland yet. But if you look at the data from Beijing, the overall VE was only significant in one of the influenza seasons. And even for subtypes, the influenza VE was only significant for the season of 2016 to 2017. So overall, it was not doing very well. And let's take a look at the Hong Kong from data. Take a look at the data from Hong Kong. It's an entirely different story. So the overall VEs are very well. If we look at the bottom of each panel, the numbers are generally close to and even higher than 50%, although for some of the seasons it was not doing very well. However, the vaccine in Hong Kong did not do very well last year. This is a study reported, published on vaccine. It reported the VE against H3N2 among Hong Kong children from June to November of 2023. And none of the estimates was statistically significant. But I need to remind you that for this period, it mostly belonged to the season before the last season. It mostly belonged to the season of 2022 to 2023, not 2023 to 2024. So we can also compare with the data from the US. In the US, the VE against H3N2 was 55% in the last season. It was very close to our estimate against H3N2. And the same thing in Canada, actually. The VE against H3N2 was also somewhere around 50%. In Europe, however, the estimates were unanimously statistically insignificant. So it's pretty much like Hong Kong. I don't know what happened to the vaccines in Europe in the past season. So several take-home messages. The vaccines in Shenzhen did do very well in the past season. Sorry, I meant 2023 to 2024. It did reduce infections among school children, and it did better against BV than against H3N2. But in the future, we need to study the long-term VE of vaccines among students, and we also need to evaluate the VE against severe cases and hospitalizations instead of just protecting against outpatient visits. Thank you. That's my report today.
Thank you so much. Today, we have a wonderful discussion and sections about influenza vaccines. So I learned a few things, but overall, I think that this section highlights two things. We have existing seasonal influenza vaccines, and then also in the coming years, we will have a novel influenza vaccines. For the existing influenza vaccines, it is not perfect, but it's doing something. It still saves life and also reduce the disease burden in the community, in particular to the high-risk group. So I think in the coming years, we should try to use the vaccines and try to generate more evidence to inform our policymaker, to communicate with our communities, so to enhance the vaccine uptake overall, so that we can prepare platforms. In future, when we have the next generation influenza vaccine, which is more potent, more long-lasting, and more universal, we can able to capture and use the existing platform to try to disseminate these vaccines, the new vaccines, much better than before, so that we can have an overall much more successful vaccination program for influenza and perhaps for other infectious diseases as well, through these activities. So today, we conclude these sections, and I don't know, Professor Pang, have any else want to say? Professor Pang, do you want to say something? Okay, so without any further comments, and I just want to conclude these sections, and thanks for your time to join the discussion, and also I would like to thank all the speakers who have been actually contributing a wonderful discussion to us. Thank you. Thank you.